So what we're going to talk to you about today, we're from the Health Sciences Library. I'm a librarian at McMaster's Health Sciences Library, and Jennifer is the director of the Health Sciences Library. And we're going to talk about how you can understand research impact, the impact that your research is having by looking at what are called bibliometrics. And bibliometrics are kind of a sort of a fancy term, but I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with some key bibliometrics. And we're going to give you kind of a history of how bibliometrics have been used to understand research impact, and then look at some opportunities to improve that process by engaging with the library to try and help yourself and your faculty members understand how to really tell the story of the impact that research is having. So I'll start off just by way of defining what bibliometrics are, and by highlighting four familiar metrics that you might have seen before. And so the first one, and really the simplest to wrap your head around, is publications. Just looking at the aggregate number of publications that an author or group of authors has produced. The idea behind this bibliometric indicator is that if you're producing a lot of research, chances are you'll be having some sort of impact. The issue, of course, with just looking at aggregate publications is that just because you produce a lot of research doesn't necessarily mean that research is doing anything. And this is where some of the subsequent metrics come into play. So a focus on something like journal impact factor takes a look at the impact of where the journals where the research is ultimately being published. So journal impact factor is basically the average number of citations an article in a given journal can be expected to receive. The idea behind this metric is if you're publishing in high impact journals, it's more likely that your work is going to get picked up and cited. Of course, there's drawbacks with this as well, because there's no way to sort of control when you're looking specifically at a journal level metric like this. You're not really looking at the impact of individual research outputs. So what that means is that you could have a really high impact piece of work be published in a lower impact journal, or vice versa. You could publish in a really high impact journal, but maybe your particular publication doesn't get that much attention. So impact factor has its problems when trying to sort of describe somebody, the impact of a group of researchers. We can also look at citations of the actual individual research outputs themselves. So this at least is focusing on the research that's being done, and we can get a better sense of exactly how it's being used. But looking at aggregate citations can't always give you the context that you need to fully understand how these citations sort of come out. So as an example, you could have a set of 10 research articles that had received 100 citations as an aggregate, and maybe all 100 of those citations came on one of those articles and the rest haven't received any attention. And so you can ask yourself, is that group of articles as impactful as another set of 10 where every article received 10 citations? And this is where a metric like H-index comes in, which tries to take into account some of the consistency of citation generation. So an H-index of 5, for example, means that a researcher has 5 publications that have received at least 5 citations. Once their 6th most cited publication receives 6 citations, their H-index will go up to 6. So H-index is a metric that grows throughout your career. So these are 4 of the most sort of popular and traditionally used bibliometric indicators when it comes to impact. And each of them has their own use cases, but as you can see, they each have their own drawbacks as well. And these drawbacks are underlined even further when we consider this idea that when we consider these sorts of numbers outside of context, when we just present raw data, like when we just present an H-index without context, it can't really tell us very much because bibliometric data is really dependent on a number of elements. First of all, it's source dependent. What that means is that the data source that you pull this information from is really important in telling you what the actual final number means. So your H-index in Google Scholar may be very different, or not very different, but it may be different from your H-index in Web of Science or from your H-index in Scopus. And this doesn't mean one is right and one is wrong. It simply means that you're pulling the information from a different data source. So if you're presenting your H-index without explaining what the data source is, the number really can't tell you very much. Similarly, If we look at bibliometrics, they're very discipline dependent as well. So a field like the health sciences, where citation activity is really high, is quite different when you consider it alongside maybe a research area like philosophy, where there's not as much of a focus on publishing in academic journals and gaining citations. So if we don't know what discipline a group of researchers is from, it's really hard to tell whether an aggregate citation count is impactful or not. And finally, bibliometric data is very researcher dependent as well. So if you have a new researcher, maybe they're only been working in the area for 5 years, they're going to have a lot of harder time driving up their H-index versus somebody who's been in the field for 30, 40 years. So when we look at aggregate numbers on their own outside of context, when we just provide the number, it actually can't tell us very much. It's not very helpful. And when taken to the extremes, it can actually be quite harmful. So I'm going to pass it over to Jennifer to talk about some of the pitfalls that come along with metrics.
So I'm Jennifer, and I work in library administration. And so I know that many of our research administrators are regularly approached by vendors who are really eager to sell us these citation reports and bibliometric reports and analyses. And it is very attractive. It really gives us some insight into our research. But it's important to know that, and I think I saw in the chat, libraries can do this for you. So you can save some money. And Jack will talk a little bit at the end of this talk about how we're doing that at McMaster. But before you generate the report or buy the report, you need to really start to understand what you're looking at. And Jack's already alluded to this. Sometimes bibliometric reports will overvalue certain types of research. So, for example, we know publication volume is different in different disciplines. And if the metric that you're using is relying on volume, you're almost always going to overvalue certain disciplines as compared to others. To give you an example, something like medical research that's published in a journal like JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine, where the publication comes out weekly, and you compare that to something like the Journal of Advanced Nursing, which comes out monthly, or other titles that come out quarterly, what you're going to see over time is that you'll end up overvaluing certain disciplines like medicine as compared to nursing, even though that wasn't your intention. You also need to consider where your research is published, as certain metrics will overvalue certain types of publications. So, for example, we might have an Indigenous scholar who chooses to publish in either an Indigenous health journal, or maybe they want their report tied to an agency or a government website because they're trying to reach the most appropriate audience for their research. But for a variety of reasons, including the fact that high-impact journals overemphasize studies with positive outcomes using traditional research methodologies, this Indigenous scholarship that it might be overlooked or undervalued in your analysis. Similarly, if you're working in a new or emerging area, you might be doing groundbreaking research, but it's disseminated in a new journal that simply hasn't been around long enough to generate the high impact factors that Jack spoke of. And so again, when you're doing the analysis, some of this groundbreaking work can be overlooked. And then finally, you really need to understand the mounds of data that gets presented to you in an analysis. And if you've ever seen these demos, the library does them, vendors do them, it's really attractive and it's really fast. You get these great visualizations and tables, but it's important to know what story this data is really telling. I'll expand on what I mean by storytelling on the next slide. So in spite of sort of the cautionary tales about volume metrics or certain publication metrics, there are some exciting opportunities. And I alluded to the idea that we can use these metrics to tell stories. So for example, when you're pulling your data, you might want to measure a specific change. For example, you might be able to tell advancement that your research profile changed significantly after receiving a large donation. And you can show that just an influx of money can make a monumental difference to your output. You can use data to show how your research interests might be expanding into more diverse publications, that your research is representing different author types, different methodologies, different technology use. Or finally, you can look for changes that reflect something you've done internally. So I know at McMaster, a number of us are changing our faculty recruitment policies to be more inclusive. There's investment in new research spaces, there's investment in new equipment. Over time, we can use this data to see if we're making the changes that we want to be making.
So ultimately, it's really about using the data in an intentional way. And so some of the points that Jennifer touched on are mentioning this idea of asking more focused questions when it comes to research impact. So instead of saying, what is the impact of my research? Maybe you isolate what impact means to you, right? So maybe it's, who do I have the most success collaborating with, for example? Now that we have a bit more of a focused question, we can answer that. And maybe we find that you collaborate well with universities across Canada, but maybe you'd like to deepen your collaboration with international organizations. So that helps you set things like internal benchmarks. Now you have the number of collaborations you've had to this point. You can look at your metrics again in 5 years and see if you're able to achieve the goals that you've set for yourself. So it's about understanding how this data can help support the stories you want to tell and help you plan for the future so that you can actually reach the goals that you have. As far as next steps for the audience goes, I know that not everybody here is from McMaster, and those who aren't, I'd suggest, or I'd recommend that you reach out to your own home libraries and see what types of research impact services they have. For those at McMaster, the Health Sciences Library is more than happy to share their expertise and resources to help support the responsible use of bibliometric data. We can talk about a whole range of topics, not limited to alternative indicators that we have. So we have tools available that can generate normalized indicators that can take into account research area and publication date. So kind of baking in some of the context that I talked about earlier into the actual data points themselves. We can talk about alternative metrics like alt metrics, which focus on not citation count, but attention that research has gained in the media, for example. So an alternate way, a slightly different way of looking at impact versus traditional citation counts. And we can talk about developing transparent methodologies so that when somebody asks you how you generated that number, you can very quickly show them a reproducible process. And that really just makes the data that you're able to present much more valid.
We also need to think a little bit about information privilege because we're sort of entrenched in Western publication models and Western publication outputs. We actually are sitting at a bit of an advantage compared to other parts of the world. And so again, that's something you want to think about when you're doing these analyses.
And really just any other questions you have about responsible use of bibliometric data, we're happy to sit down and have a conversation. We're really, we have, as I mentioned, we have a number of resources. We have built the expertise in this area. And so we're excited to engage with different groups across campus to work on this.